So welcome everybody to this Catalyst seminar on advances in trauma and traumatic stress, which is the first seminar of this academic year. And we've got two absolutely outstanding speakers. I will introduce both of them to start with, and then they will each give their presentation, and we'll take questions at the end of both presentations. So if you have specific questions for Rachel, who goes first, please jot those down and you can put them to the chat or ask them in person when both of the talks are finished. So our first speaker is Professor Rachel Hiller. She's Professor of Child and Adolescent Mental Health and leading the Child Trauma and Recovery Research Group here at UCL. Most of her research is focused on improving the identification and support of the mental health needs of care-experienced young people, including a focus on service pathways and access between children's social care and mental health services. Her research is co-developed with care-experienced young people, caregivers and professionals. She's also a member of the Executive Committee and Board of Directors for the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, where she also chairs the Public Health and Policy Committee. Our second speaker is Dr. Naresh Hanchate. He is UCL Excellence Fellow at the UCL Institute of Child Health, Genetics and Genomic Medicine Department. And the mission of his lab is to unravel circuit mechanisms through which the brain controls physiology and behavior, particularly those involved in innate functions such as stress, reproduction and appetite. And he's also interested in how this circuitry plays a role in neurodevelopmental and neuropsychiatric disorders. He employs novel single-cell genomic tools, especially RNA sequencing, genetic tools, and systems neuroscience approaches. And his work is highly collaborative, working with clinicians, geneticists, and translational neuroscientists to understand genetic mechanisms underlying neurodevelopmental and neuroendocrine disorders, with long-term goal of developing novel therapies. So these are two people using very different approaches, but which will help us triangulate how stress gets under the skin and increases mental health problems or risk of mental health problems. So I'm going to hand over to Rachel now, who I have no doubt will give a very exciting talk.
No pressure. Thank you, Essi. Let me just share my screen. Thank you. So I'll just presume everyone can hear me and see me and get on with the talk. So for the 20 minutes of my talk today, I'm going to be focusing on the work my research group have been doing around meeting the trauma-related mental health needs of care-experienced young people. So when we're thinking about kind of advances in the trauma field, if I don't necessarily like to think of work that way, but if we think of it in that way, this is about half of what we do is looking at psychological or cognitive and social mechanisms that drive mental health and well-being in this population. But a lot of what we do in terms of advances is looking at the service-facing side. So we already know a lot about child trauma and mental health. We know trauma is a major risk factor for mental health, but we know there's very poor access to best evidence care out in services. So a lot of what we do is trying to unpack that as well. And in this 20 minutes, hopefully I'll just give you a kind of whistle stop of the work we've done. I'm starting with my acknowledgement slides because I never get to it and it's very important. So the work I'm presenting today has been led by amazing postdocs and RAs and PhD students over the years. We also have a care experience advisory panel. They wrote a blog for the NIHR a couple of months ago. The title's there if people are interested in it. They guide all of our work and we're really grateful for their input. And then there's some key academic collaborators on the right-hand side there. So just to give a bit of background to set the context of the group of young people I'm talking about here. So the formal name, if you look at, for example, Department for Education documents for this group of young people, is looked after children. So these are young people that have been removed from the care of their biological parent or parents and put in local authority care. And we have about 90,000 young people in care in the UK. That number is growing each year. The most common reason a child would be placed into care is because of abuse and or neglect, so child maltreatment. But we also know they're a group that have experienced a lot of other adversities very commonly. So things like early exposure to parental mental health and drug and alcohol abuse, missed education opportunities, poverty, and of course, separation from your family and being put in care in itself can be an incredibly stressful experience. In the UK context, most children come into care from school age or older, and adolescence is our fastest growing age group entering the care system. So often these experiences have been going on for quite a long time by the time they get into this system. And then, as I alluded to earlier, we have to also acknowledge that the process of being moved into care can be incredibly stressful. And actually, lots of young people identify that as their most traumatic experience, which I think says a lot about what we could do better around that process as well. So then you enter a care system and your options for support are inherently very disrupted. So you've been separated from your family, and that means you've moved homes, you've sometimes moved schools, you've been separated from your siblings. Even if you come into care with your siblings, sibling separation through placements is still very common. And we know that at least a third of young people in care will change placements each year. So that means they change who their caregiver is, they change what house they live in, they change what neighbourhood they live in, etc. And then over all of that, they find themselves navigating incredibly complex systems, and sometimes without a consistent adult advocate. The children's social care system, NHS systems, education systems, really, really complex systems for any of us to navigate, but particularly for a young person that's in the care system. So we already know a lot about the mental health outcomes for young people in care. There's some pretty good administrative data. A lot of it's not from the UK, but we've had some really excellent UK work done in this area as well. And we know that around 50% of young people in care meet criteria for a diagnosable mental health condition, as in like a DSM-5 ICD mental health condition. But it's also likely that there's very high rates of sub-threshold symptoms that are still causing significant problems for that child. And partly that's because what we also know from the evidence, we've shown it in our research and other groups have shown it, is that young people in care tend to underreport their mental health symptoms. And they also underreport maltreatment experiences. And that's something important to hold in mind in terms of clinical care. We also know that their mental health needs are often chronic. So we did a study a few years ago now where we pulled the strengths and difficulties questionnaire. So lots of you on the call will know the SDQ. In this context, the SDQ is in English local authorities a requirement to be done each year, and it's reported to the Department for Education. So we pulled SDQs from 3 local authorities and looked at how internalising and externalising difficulties change over the first 3 years from when you come into care. Because of course, coming into care is in itself an intervention. And essentially what we found here is that over 70% of young people that have a high SDQ score in the first year in care still have a high SDQ score, as in clinically elevated SDQ score, in their 3rd year in care. And actually we've also shown this in their 5th year in care. So there's as a mental health intervention, coming into the care system is not a good one. We need to be doing more to support their mental health needs. And the reason we really want to do better is because these needs and how can I put it, the failure to address the mental health needs of this group has some pretty devastating consequences for the kind of lifelong outcomes of this group. So we know, for example, that children in care with higher mental health needs are more likely to have placements break down. That's very likely a kind of cyclical association. And we also know that this is a group that comprise around 1% of the UK population of youth, but a quarter of our homeless population and half of our young prison population. They're also up to 20 times more likely to be excluded from school. Now, addressing mental health is not going to fix all of those challenges, but a lot of the drivers of what we see in these types of outcomes with care experienced young people is a kind of chronic failure to have identified and addressed their needs in the care system. So today I'm going to focus on post-traumatic stress disorder. And I guess one question you might ask is why focus so specifically in on something like PTSD when this is a group that often have complex comorbidities alongside a primary diagnosis? Firstly, just to say we actually don't just look at PTSD. So about half of what my group do is looking at transdiagnostic mental health, but I'm going to focus on PTSD for the talk today. But we also know that this group have experienced very high rates of interpersonal trauma, which of course many on the call will know is a major risk factor for PTSD. We also know actually that rates of PTSD are very high in this group. So when you do screening tools, which are not diagnostic, obviously, they're anywhere from about a third of the sample up to 3/4 of the sample are screening above clinical threshold on standardized PTSD instruments. Certainly, we've just finished baseline of our next longitudinal study, and 60% of the children are screening above a clinical threshold on a PTSD tool. So very high symptomology. I think one of the things that also is more hopeful when you're researching with this group and looking at PTSD is that we've actually already got very good screening tools and very good treatments for PTSD and for complex PTSD. So if we can work out some of the challenges of access, theoretically, we do have some models of knowing how to help, even if they're imperfect. So before I get into the kind of access to services, one of the first kind of large studies we ran with children under local authority care was in response to more clinical facing work we were trying to do with services around a NICE recommended mental health interventions. And they would basically just say, Rachel, we just don't think what you know about PTSD applies to our group of young people. So we had a look at that. We took that as an empirical question and we ran a longitudinal study. It's published open access, so anyone can look at it in more detail. And we essentially wanted to quite simply know whether the cognitive models of PTSD, which underlie our best evidence treatments, are applicable to young people in care. And we looked at this in a longitudinal study of 120 10 to 17-year-olds in care. We found they were highly applicable. So the three aspects, which I won't go into detail about, of the cognitive model, the memory quality, fragmentation in their memory, maladaptive appraisals, and coping, which is essentially avoidant coping, were all correlated with PTSD and complex PTSD at baseline and a 12-month follow-up. But in our longitudinal models, it was particularly their maladaptive appraisals that were robust drivers of PTSD and complex PTSD, even when controlling for baseline symptom severity. We also found that their pre-care maltreatment severity, so the kind of objective severity of their pre-care experiences, were not a robust driver of mental health symptoms. In fact, they weren't significantly associated with mental health symptoms. So it was really about these processes in the middle, their interpretation and coping with those events, that was maintaining PTSD symptom severity, which is what we see in lots of other trauma-exposed groups of young people. So moving through to challenges to accessing best evidence support. I haven't looked at the time, I'm sorry, that is hopeless of me, but I'm sure someone will interrupt me if I'm going on for too long. When we're thinking of access to support, the first thing we're often interested in is, do we actually identify PTSD? Anecdotally, and in the qualitative work we've done, we were seeing so many kids scoring highly on PTSD measures, and many were in mental health services, but no one was talking about PTSD, even those with very high PTSD symptoms. So we're increasingly interested in this area of actually, do we identify need well in this group? And I think the quick answer is we do not do a good job of identifying need in this group. And I'm going to show you two studies where we looked at that. One is the baseline data from a longitudinal study that we're running at the moment called Rethink. And this is 10 to 17-year-olds in care. And this looked at whether the SDQ is good at detecting clinically elevated PTSD symptoms. And just to clarify up front, that the SDQ is not designed to do that. And so it's not a slight on the SDQ. The reason we look at that is because, as I mentioned earlier, for children in care, this is basically the only measure you're ever getting access to, is the SDQ, and it will be carer report SDQ most of the time. So it's really about, does what we do as services pick up these young people? And this study, which is under review at the moment, found that the SDQ misses over half of young people in care who score in the clinical range on a PTSD screener. So our screening processes are likely to miss large numbers of young people in care with high PTSD symptoms. But what about if we can actually get to mental health services? So one of the things we often see in our qualitative work is pretty major dissatisfaction with mental health services. But of course, mental health services are chronically underfunded. A lot of families struggle in access. That is not necessarily something unique to the care experience community, and it's hard from qualitative research to understand what is because you're in care and what is a general reflection of the challenges of accessing mental health services at the moment. So we looked at this in a randomized vignette study. We were interested in how mental health professionals made diagnostic decisions. So they were randomized to receive a vignette, and the vignettes were identical. They described a young person who had experienced interpersonal trauma and described PTSD symptoms. In one vignette, the child was in care. In one, they lived with their mother, but that was the only difference. And this difference alone led to differences in diagnostic decisions. So those randomized to the in-care vignette were far less likely to identify PTSD. It followed they were far less likely to endorse a NICE recommended PTSD treatment. There was an over-identification of attachment disorder. And across the board, it showed what we'd seen anecdotally, that there's a heavy reliance on the term developmental trauma as a mental health outcome in our services. That's tricky because developmental trauma doesn't exist as a defined mental health outcome and certainly doesn't have a treatment pathway. I won't have time to go into that in detail, but happy to talk about that in questions. So here we've got this kind of accumulation of evidence of inequity in access and decision making. You might think of it as kind of diagnostic overshadowing, where we're not identifying needs in a way that might promote access to good treatments. So what about, to finish up, access to best evidence treatments? So this project is what's called an active implementation trial. It was the first implementation trial I've run. So if there's any implementation researchers on the call, I can only apologise. But we run this, we're still running it with 28 mental health teams all across England. And the goal here was to really dig into what mental health services need to deliver trauma-focused CBT to care experienced young people. So we trained over 200 mental health professionals. They came from general CAMs that are specific for looked after children, other outpatient clinics, and social care mental health teams. And there's a huge amount of mixed methods data that this draws on, just under 60 focus groups, individual interviews, and service data. And after some pretty significant training and scaffolding, we found that just under half of the teams were able to use cognitive therapy for PTSD, but only a quarter used it with care experienced young people. So the goal of this work, the first paper's just been published actually, and it's open access, was to understand what differentiates services that can and can't implement. We use the consolidated framework for implementation research, which you can see here. And there were essentially, I mean, you can imagine this was a more complex than what I'm presenting here, but there were two major unique differentiators of whether services implemented or not. The first was their commissioning and service setup, and the second was the team culture and therapist beliefs around evidence-based practice. A lot of the teams, in fact, all of them, talked about the challenges of meeting the complex needs of these young people, and we have to acknowledge that it's incredibly hard work, but it wasn't a unique differentiator of implementation. So those using the intervention are still obviously grappling with those challenges. Their children aren't less complex. So for the next few minutes, I'm just going to focus in on commissioning, just because I think it's quite interesting, and I can't go over it all today, but happy to answer questions, of course. So when we map where the young people in this study are going, what we saw very clearly is that for looked after children, they are predominantly getting mental health support from specialist teams. So these are teams set up to meet their mental health needs. So that makes sense, right? And that's a social care based team or a looked after children CAMS team. Those teams do amazing work, really amazing, and we need more of them. But predominantly those teams are only commissioned to work with the network around the child. So if you are in those teams, the child doesn't get seen for an assessment or for intervention. The intervention is with the carer or the social worker. Still very important work, unlikely to address PTSD or complex PTSD. But then there was very little in the way of referrals into CAMS. And actually a lot of our CAMS teams didn't implement with care experienced young people because they didn't see any over the 18 months that they were in the study. So what we really started to be able to map here is the kind of lack of clear pathways between these different services, and also that lots of services are not actually aware of each other's practice. And I think, unfortunately, one of the key take-home messages from the Dept project was that currently in England, because of commissioning and service setup, looked after children cannot access NICE recommended psychotherapy. There's just simply not services available to them. I think we need to be looking at how to address that. So to finish, just to summarise what I've presented today, there's obviously high mental health needs in this group. I don't think we need to keep labouring that point. It's very clear from lots of different research groups, including some amazing work led by Tams and Ford and published back in 2007. We know that there's high mental health needs, but we're also increasingly evidencing poor access to evidence-based support, compounded by therapeutic biases, diagnostic overshadowing, and commissioning and training issues, as well as issues of whether mental health services in England actually buy into evidence-based practice. But luckily, there are also examples of excellent practice that we could scale. And at the moment, we're developing a case series of best practice for between children's social care and CAMHS. So we can look at how you can scale that in other regions. But clearly, trauma-focused CBT is one intervention. It's a very high intensity intervention. Another part of work my team do is looking at low intensity options for this group of young people. And so in terms of just some key next steps, in case it's helpful for question time, we're also running a project over the next year looking at commissioners' decision-making, not an area I usually work in, but very, very interesting. We've got ICBs and social care commissioners making decisions, sometimes together, sometimes not. We're also interested particularly in the role of social networks around children in care because of the kind of unique living situation they find themselves in, and the role of comprehensive mental health assessments at the social care level, and the development of policy and practice frameworks from this evidence. That's it from me. There's a lot of great dissemination on the UK Trauma Council website. That's all free resources. If you're interested in child trauma, I'd suggest checking it out. And that's some of the research team. Thank you. I hope that was 20 minutes.
Brilliant, Rachel. Hugely interesting talk and really, really important work, and such a key to do that in an evidence-based way. So I'm sure there's been a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure you will get a lot of questions in the chat or otherwise. So you're going to move to our next speaker now. So Naresh, do you have your slides ready?
Can you hear me, Essi?
Yes, we can.
Can you see my slides?
Looking perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. So first, I would like to thank Patricia, Essi, the organizers for giving me this opportunity. And I've been always attending these Catalyst seminars, and you always have a fascinating line of speakers. So I feel honored to be one of the speakers speaking today, and I'm very happy to share and excited to share the work we do in my group at UCL Institute of Child Health. So for those who don't know me, I've completed my education in India, and I've obtained my PhD in neuroscience in France, and then I've done a postdoctoral fellow in Seattle, and then I've joined UCL just after the pandemic in 2021, and I just started, having my group started like since last year. So the work that I'm going to present is most of the work that I've done during the postdoc, but also some work that we are currently doing in my group. So thanks to Rachel, she's given a very nice overview of the problem we are facing currently, not just in the UK, but across the world, on the kind of different mental health problems the children and the young people and adolescents are facing. The work in my group, what we're trying to do is to investigate the neural circuit and molecular mechanisms that predispose individuals to these different mental health disorders late in adulthood. Like rightly mentioned, there's increased prevalence rate of neurodevelopmental disorders like autism, and increased traumatic experiences that early children and adolescent experience that lead to mental health disorders. So what we do in my group is use different mice models of autism and early life stress, try to mimic these early life traumatic experiences that the children and others undergo. It's not very exactly like what we face in the real world, but still these are very powerful and useful tools to investigate the circuits and also understand the mechanisms. So the questions we are trying to look at is, we know that these early adversities do impact brain function. We do know that is, the severity and of the trauma and the duration of trauma can have detrimental effects on different brain areas, but also on the circuits and the molecules and certain genes implicated in them. And there's also, the genetic component, which contributes to high susceptibility or resilience. So we're looking into those mechanisms as well, and also the sex differences, why certain disorders are female, highly prevalent in women, and certain others highly prevalent in boys or men. So to map out the circuitry, one would need to understand, we are looking at the impact of trauma on brain circuits. So we thought about it in various ways, and we felt, the circuits which are regulating stress could be the ones which are highly vulnerable to these traumatic experiences, because we know, in these patients with mental illnesses, there's impaired regulation of stress responses, there's heightened level of anxiety, both in terms of behavior, but also in terms of physiological responses. So now in the brain, there's a number of neural circuit pathways that respond to stress and elicit behavioral and physiological responses. One of the important pathways among these is the HP axis, or the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which is commonly called. And this axis, once it detects a stressor, it elicits a stress response by activating the CRH neurons, or the corticotropin releasing hormone neurons within the hypothalamus. And that results into release of this hormone into the circulation, that ultimately results in increase of cortical release from the adrenal glands. And as we know, the cortisol in turn acts on multiple tissue systems to increase the heart rate, respiration, and heighten awakening to respond to the stressor and then restore homeostasis. So in an acute condition, this is a very important and productive and adaptive mechanism. But when there's extended activation of exposure to trauma or chronic stressor, that results in high levels of cortisol that are circulating in the blood, which it also has modulatory effects on the brain. And as it is having this negative feedback for extended period of time, it can have negative impact, like on the circuits, like impaired neurogenesis, deficits in neural circuits in certain specific brain areas of the brain. And when these exposure is happening early life, the circuits that are altered may be having irreversible changes that again will lead to different mental health disorders. So we felt we could start off with these neurons, as given that they play an important role in regulating stress responses of diverse emotional, physical, and metabolic stressors. And hopefully by navigating the circuits upstream of these neurons, we would be able to map out the circuits upstream throughout the brain, but also to investigate the brain areas on this and the neurons that are specifically impacted by different trauma or early life adversities. Now, to do that, previously my colleagues Kunio Kondo and Zongwa Lu, they developed some novel viral tools by genetically engineering pseudorabies viruses. What these viruses do, these are polysynaptic and they travel in a retrograde manner, which means whereby when they're injected into hypothalamus, they replicate specifically into in the CR and as they replicate, they travel across synapses in a retrograde manner, in a timely manner. So when we map out the circuits in the brain, on day 3, for instance, we can look at the neurons that are directly upstream of CR, and on day 4, these are neurons labeled by this virus that are 2 synapses upstream of CR. Now remember, the signals, they are coming from not only the sensory systems, but also the brain areas that control emotional, psychological signals. And when we looked at the brain areas, we found that 31 different nuclei or specific brain areas are present directly upstream of these CR neurons. And this kind of makes sense, but from what has been known previously from human studies, but also other mapping approaches, where a majority of the upstream neurons are present within the hypothalamus. This is a brain area which controls basic innate functions, circadian rhythms, reproduction, fertility, and appetite, and other brain areas such as the BNST and amygdala, which control anxiety and responses to fear. And certain others like the midbrain, which controls, you have the dopamine neurons implicated in reward and motivational behaviors, and the hindbrain, which sends inputs of the peripheral systems and the visceral inputs from the peripheral system to CR. So when we looked at on day 4, we found there were additional 59 different brain areas that provide indirect inputs to CR. So there were additional brain areas that not only directly but also indirectly communicate signals to CR. And again, these were majority of areas like the amygdala, which control fear and anxiety responses, but also neurons in the hippocampus, which is again important in regulating stress responses. So these studies have given us a good overview, a neuroanatomical map of neurons upstream of neurons. Kind of gives us a very foundation that our diverse brain areas, but also neurons are sending signals to neurons. But the question we're trying to address is, what are these different brain areas doing? What are the individual neurons within these brain areas are responding to what kind of stressors, and what about the impact of the trauma or the peripheral, the cortisol inputs, and also the neurodevelopmental aspect and the early life aspect. How are those signals impacting these different neurons in different brain areas? And to address this question, it's important to identify the molecular entities of these neurons in different brain areas. As we know, in the brain, there's an extreme diversity of neurons within the brain in terms of their size, the shapes, the electrophysiological properties, which in turn is reflected by the genes expressed within these different neurons. So for that, we took up this challenge of defining the molecular identities of upstream neurons. Now, I'll remember this is a huge challenge because upstream neurons are present scattered in diverse brain areas. And there's a highly specific circuit which is genetically defined. So they're very rare compared to the huge number of cells that are present in the brain. And we lack tools to selectively isolate these cells which are connected in a circuit and define the molecular identities of these cells. So I led several projects on these development of new tools, and we went ahead and developed 2 tools termed ConnectSeq and Nuclear ConnectSeq, where we developed another virus called PRVB180, where it has been engineered to express GFP, which is a green fluorescent protein. And as the virus travels across synapses in a retrograde manner, it in turn labels the cells with GFP. So we can then isolate the brain area, dissociate the cells into single cells, and sort them using FACS flow cytometry into 96 well plate, and then do single cell RNA sequencing to detect the genes expressed in individual neurons within this circuit. Now, why do we need to do with single cells? It's because, as I said earlier, there's enormous diversity of neurons in the brain. We have to have this single cell approach to be able to define the molecular identities and the genes expressed within. So the Connect-seq was extremely challenging. We had to test different conditions, but ultimately we succeeded in kind of analyzing a very small fraction of cells within the upstream neurons. And nonetheless, we went ahead and looked into the transcriptomes of these cells, and we found, as one would expect, they were either inhibitory GABA or glutamatergic. And what was remarkable was they expressed a huge number of neuropeptides, either individually or in combination of different neuropeptides in upstream neurons. So what this tells us is the upstream neurons are employing a wide array of signaling molecules to transmit signals to CRH neurons. And as you can see, the CRH neurons need to express these diversity of receptors for these molecules. So we went ahead and analyzed transcriptomes of CRH neurons as well. And we found the corresponding putative receptors for these different signaling molecules, different ion channels for neurotransmitters, but also the respective receptors for different neuropeptides. So what this tells us is, the upstream neurons and the receptors, the CRH neurons, have the necessary machinery to kind of have the ligand receptor interactions to transmit specific signals and elicit a neuroendocrine response. So as I said, it was a proof of concept study. So we just analyzed a few cells, but in the brain, there are thousands of neurons upstream of CRH neurons. And to be able to have a clear understanding or comprehensive understanding of what these cells are doing and how they're impacted by these chronic stressors, we need a high throughput approach where we would be able to analyze thousands of cells upstream of CRH neurons. And we developed another method termed Connect-seq, where instead of dissociating the cells into single cells, we tested nuclei extraction, and we found that it is very robust, in the ability to have isolate a large number of virus-infected cells from brain. And since we're getting thousands of cells, we then use some latest chromium, 10x chromium machines, which enable us to barcode transcriptomes of thousands of cells in a single experiment. So this is a work that I was just finishing. I did before I finished my postdoc, and we have been still looking at the data, which is very exciting and very interesting to look at. And this is a single experiment from data from a single experiment, where we analyzed 6,000 cells from 3 animals. So the cells clustered into different cell types based on the markers of genes detected in the transcriptomes. And we have also aligned the transcriptomes to the PRV genome to confirm that these are virus infected, and then look at the transcriptomes on the diversity of neurons within these cells. And, what we have done so far to kind of give it in a schematic illustration, we are looking at the CRH neurons, and directly upstream, we have mapped the neurons in different brain areas that are directly upstream and the neurons that are indirectly upstream of CRH neurons. And then to be able to define the molecular identities, we developed Connect-seq, and then we were able to look at the transcriptomes of these individual cells in different brain areas. And, and finally, by measuring the genes that are activated by a stimulus, we have been able to define the transcriptomes that are activated by a specific stimulus. So these are the approaches we are taking in our group. And what we're trying to do is look at the networks, neural networks, how they're interacting within the circuits, and then how they're impacted in autism or in early life adversities. And the goal is to, if we better understand the molecular mechanisms, we're working with clinicians and our collaborators in develop some translational approaches to develop novel therapies to restore the circuit function in the brain. So with that, I would like to thank all the colleagues in Seattle with whom I was working to develop these techniques. My group currently at UCL, who are setting up these tools and all the behaviors and the mouse models we're developing. And finally, the collaborators who enable the studies at UCL and funding agencies. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Naresh. If you can stop sharing the slides, and you can either ask questions by putting your hand up, or you can ask questions by putting them in the chat, and I'm happy to read them out. So are there any questions for either of the speakers? And the speakers are obviously allowed to ask questions of each other as well. So I'm going to start the ball rolling if there are no questions at the moment. I was just wondering whether each of you might take a turn in considering what are the implications of the research of the other potentially to you. So the whole idea of these seminars is to bring people together across quite sometimes vast disciplinary sort of voids and to see if we can engender some crosstalk. And I'm just wondering, to what extent watching the other person's talk do you think, okay, well, this is still a long way away, but in a kind of a magical world where things progress really fast, I can see how this might be useful for me in the future. Or after listening to the other person's talk, if it has caused you slightly rethink in how you might look at some aspect of what you research, I'd be really interested to hear some reflections from each of you. Rachel, do you want to go first?
Go first? I mean, it was really interesting, Naresh, that it is like almost another language to me, your research area. It is so different to what I'm used to. So I was thinking as you were talking, what's the middle ground between these two areas of research that have similar goals in many ways, but are so different in their approach. And I was going to ask you what you thought it was, but I guess increasingly the work I'm doing is basically just kind of accepting that the trauma has happened. I mean, the idea that we're preventing something almost seems laughable sometimes. The kids are here, they're really struggling, we're not meeting their needs. And so it's trying to like move through the mess of how can we actually make sense of this and do something helpful. Whereas I wonder if you're taking on this very noble and important piece of work about how can we actually just prevent things getting to where they are by the time they're coming into my research. But I was interested, you touched on it at the end about working with clinicians around intervention. And I mean, I'm really interested to know from you what in your dream world, what does that look like?
Yeah, thanks so much, Rachel. So, when you were presenting your work, right, and all the interactions I have with clinicians, oftentimes we come across questions like, in the real world, like with humans, it's uncontrollable. The trauma's already happened, but in terms of the experiments we are doing, this is something we can control. Like for instance, recently, this is very preliminary. We are doing this chronic social isolation across adolescents, and we're looking at the sex differences, the behavioral effects, the physiological effects, and we are finding that there might be some effect on the adrenal glands themselves, like they might be shrinking in the males or females. There's some effects, but also the bilaterality. There's some differential effects in the left side and the right side. But this is very preliminary. We just started doing this. And one of our clinicians just shared some experience from his work is, they find a lot of children with chronic fatigue syndrome, and they have hypocortisolism. And that's what we're observing with the mouse model also, is when they have chronic social isolation, there's a reduced basal level of cortisol. Well, in mice, it's corticosterone. But also when we acutely stress them with a physical restraint or the stressor, they don't elicit as robust response as a healthy animal. So it kind of gives us, a lot of insights that definitely there's impact on the brain and the way the system is eliciting a response. Now, what we are trying to do is maybe can we increase more stressors or maybe reduce the duration of isolation and see how differently it can impact. And also then test different interventions and see if we can reverse these phenotypes.
I guess I was sort of, if I can continue a little bit, so I was thinking, Rachel, would you see any merit in possibly using some of these sorts of approaches to support like relearning, like if you try and sort of rebuild the way people construct their world, do you think there would be any room? I mean, I appreciate there's a whole host of ethical issues there, and these sorts of approaches should be obviously co-developed with people. But I do know from kind of other areas of mental health research that sometimes cognitive behavioral approaches, for instance, can be supported by pharmacological approaches and can help them sort of to take off.
Yeah, why not? I think anything should be on the table within the bounds of ethics.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the children we work with, they never have just PTSD, and they actually have a lot of, I mean, there's incredibly high rates of neurodevelopmental conditions in looked after children. And there we see the same diagnostic overshadowing, not getting access to medication that they need, not getting access to diagnoses, to therapy. So I'm not like a purist with that kind of thing. I think we should be looking at what the needs of the individual child are. And sometimes that's medication, sometimes that's psychotherapy, sometimes that's both. I think we should always be open. And also we need to improve on what we're doing, because even if we do our best ever CBT, it doesn't help everyone. So I think we need to be reaching across the aisle and working out what we can learn from each other.
Yeah, that's great. Now, there are a few questions in the chat. So first, there's a question for Rachel. So you mentioned you are developing a case series on best practice based on the results of your recent study. Could you share more about the types of low intensity intervention options being implemented and whether you have evidence to date about them being evidence-based and effective, or is that something that you're still collecting?
Yeah, so to be brief with the case series, it's looking at it's more looking at the structures of services, like how do we identify children, what are their referral pathways, does the social care and CAMS leadership ever meet? So it's more looking at the key ingredients for a functional service between social care and mental health. And then once they get into mental health, does that service buy into evidence-based practice? So it's not intervention specific, it's about the kind of package of service delivery. We ran a feasibility trial a couple of years ago using a low intensity intervention called teaching recovery techniques, 5-session PTSD, traumatic stress kind of intervention. And it has raised questions that we haven't circled back to yet because of the busyness of other things, about the role of low intensity interventions for children with very complex needs. We're all being pushed for low intensity work and preventative work and work that saves money for services, and we all know the reasons for that. But I do think we also need to be careful that we're not putting a small plaster over what is a very complex problem. So the pilot actually showed it was feasible to look at that in a larger trial. But there were some risk issues. But one of the biggest challenges we have is that often young people with the most mental health needs don't have a consistent caregiver. And that is a lot to grapple with for services and for researchers. So the low intensity work and the case series are quite separate, but both complicated in their own ways.
I'm muted. That's very helpful. I think there is also, I guess, the issue of some of these most vulnerable young people being least able to advocate for themselves and not having the adult to advocate for them. So there is a sort of a danger of when the focus all goes to the low intensity and prevention, that people in the greatest need may lose out and may not be able to adequately voice their opinion about that.
Absolutely. I mean, any of us that have had to navigate NHS services for anything know that you often have to advocate a lot to get to what you need. And that's very hard for a child to do that has multiple adult gatekeepers around them as well. So there's a big piece around that needs to be unpacked around children's voices and their right to receiving. You know, if you take a rights-based approach, children have a right to access the best treatments for their needs. And how we do that is what we're trying to, that's the question we're trying to solve.
Yeah. So Naresh, there's a question for you, which I think you sort of partially answered in your conversation with Rachel, but perhaps if there's anything you want to add to possible examples of what might be novel therapies that might come about from your body of research.
Yeah, I think it's a very complex question. The answer would be very difficult to give a straightforward answer to that. But what we believe, hope is, if we get a better understanding of the circuit changes that are happening, one other thing is that is could be coming out is the neuropeptides, which are very important neuromodulators in the brain, but also in terms of like social behaviors. I could give a couple of examples like oxytocin, vasopressin, and CRH, which are implicated in these social aspects. And we if these levels are going down in these models, then we can use some gene therapy approaches to elevate the expression levels or downregulate them either chronically or acutely using some LNPs, lipid nanoparticles, to just boost the levels for a certain period of time and try to induce some plastic changes so that the circuits are modified and restored function. So these are some few things that we can try and thinking of. So that's like the impact of environmental stressors. Whereas if you have a genetic mutation, then there's a personalized medicine approach where we need to have like those particular gene encoding a functional protein restored in this within the brain. I think that's the way to go. So there's a genetic component, but also this other component where depending on the stressor and the model and the chronicity, then we might need some alternative approaches.
I guess there's a question for both more kind of neurobiological and also psychotherapeutic approaches, which is that to the extent that we're trying to change the circuits, but whether that's via sort of biochemical or psychological mechanisms, you do also think, well, if you normalize the circuit, then you have to be able to provide a more normative environment as well. Because in many cases, these are adaptations that are there for a reason. So if you can't guarantee that the child now has a more normative and stable environment, you may have unintended iatrogenic consequences.
I think it's really important. I think we'd need to be looking at the risk of doing harm in some of this work as well. But that, the reality is these kids are already there with needs, and services need to know what to do with them now. They can't wait for us to do 5-year RCTs. So there's a real balance to be had, but that's exactly what services are grappling with. If we don't know if this child is safe, can we treat PTSD? What does that look like? These are, I think they're really important questions for us to look at as researchers.
Yeah. So the question from Isabel to you, Rachel, which is saying that misdiagnosis and or failure to make evidence-based, often sort of comorbid diagnoses leading to correct EP treatment care and pathway seems a big problem in parts of community camps, not just because of lack of resource or expertise, but also ideologically sometimes. So a problem for complex cases such as your looked after population, persistent severe physical illness symptoms, gender incongruence, addictions, etc., etc. So how do you tackle this ideological stance nationally? Adult IAPT made a good start with clear leadership, but obviously we know that the child IAPT hasn't quite achieved the same thing.
No, yeah, it's a good question. I just yell at people till they listen to me. No, I'm joking. I think these are the questions we need to be asking at a national level, right? That if I always think, like, if a looked after child broke their leg and went to hospital and were told, oh, we do have a treatment for this, but we're not going to give it to you because you're really complex, we would not allow that, would we? So there is something here about how we see mental health, and how we apply treatments to that, where we're more like, does CBT align with my beliefs, or do I want to do a different therapy? And certainly in the Dept trial, there was a huge pushback against NICE guidelines, like major against NICE guidelines, trauma focused CBT to a different level, but NICE guidelines in general. Also, CAMs are very, not universally, by the way, there's always services doing really, really good work, but universally very anti-diagnosis. And I think that is a mistake. I think that is the start of our problem, that we say we don't want to label children, which most of us would agree with, but actually that gives them access to high quality, a child's got PTSD whether we choose to tell them they do or not. Doesn't take away their symptoms by not telling them that. What it does do is help us to do psychoeducation, and it might not, for the reasons Essi's talked about, it might not be the right time for them to receive treatment, but perhaps they can have some psychoeducation, some management, some monitoring, if that's the best we can do. So I think we need to be having some important national conversations. We are doing a big project with commissioners because of this reason, Isabel, where we were like, this can't be okay. So and the commissioners, we've just done a series of roundtables. The NICE guidelines aren't like in the periphery, basically. And I think there's a real question of, if you're not commissioning evidence-based services, what are you commissioning? And if, quite rightly, services say, well, those trials aren't done with looked after children, fine, sometimes we do have to accept that. If they're going to be doing a different intervention, what evaluation do we expect them to be doing as a service? So we look at it in the national picture of commissioning practices, but also things like, we work with the DFE, the statutory guidance for looked after children, which is being updated. So some of those national pieces, and then also the other thing I just have to also say is that we get most pushback from clinical psychologists. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I feel like I'm allowed to say this. I think we need to look at our DCLIN training, and whether we're being really clear about what evidence-based practice actually means. So that's just some thoughts from that, but it's an area.
Yeah, I think that really resonated. It's exactly the same when we look at disruptive behavior disorders. People don't want to diagnose because of a label, but you think these kids are going to label themselves plenty by behaving in a particular way. So this. I feel there is a slightly sort of a misguided,
I agree,
almost moral argument wanting to be seen, not to label someone, but actually the byproduct is that the very vulnerable children often don't get the services that they need.
Yes, and then Essi, they turn 18 and they go into adult services and they've all got emotionally unstable personality disorder.
Yes, because they haven't help on time.
Because no one has helped that, so I do think we need to have a bit of a reality check with some of those conversations, but others would disagree with us, Essi.
I know, I've had those conversations plenty.
But we are obviously right.
Are there any more questions? I'm always conscious that we're running slightly after 2 o'clock, and people may be keen to get elsewhere. So we're not wedded to staying here until 15:15. So I'm going to sort of wait a few moments to see if anything crops up. Patrizia has reminded of the next Catalyst seminar, which is my job, but I'm clearly not doing a very good job. So the next seminar is 20th of November, same time. The topic will be global inequalities in children and young people's mental health. So a really, really important topic. The seminar is chaired by Provost and the speakers will be Tom Steer and Kelly Rose Clark. So I hope to see most of you there then, and maybe some other people too. So huge thanks to both speakers for absolutely brilliant, clear talks that were understandable to a wide audience and certainly generated some very interesting discussion. So thank you.
Thank you so much.